4.3 Determining the scope of the quality management system. The organization shall determine the boundaries and applicability of the quality management system to establish its scope. When determining this scope, the organization shall consider a. The external and internal issues referred to in 4.1. b. The requirements of relevant interested parties referred to in 4.2. c. The products and services of the organization. The organization shall apply all the requirements of this international standard if they are applicable within the determined scope of its quality management system. The scope of the organization's quality management system shall be available and be maintained as documented information. The scope shall state the types of products and services covered, and provide justification for any requirement of this international standard that the organization determines is not applicable to the scope of its quality management system. Conformity to this international standard may only be claimed if the requirements determined as not being applicable do not affect the organization's ability or responsibility to ensure the conformity of its products and services and the enhancement of customer satisfaction. In 4.3, Determining the scope of the quality management system, we discussed the scope of the ISO 9001:2015 standard in the previous chapter. This was in regards to the standard itself, and when the ISO 9001 requirements are applicable to an organization and its quality management system. Basically, who would benefit from establishing a QMS that is in conformity with the ISO 9001 requirements? In this section, we will discuss scope as it applies to establishing the boundaries, or the areas of the organization that are to be included and controlled within the quality management system, as well as the applicability of the ISO 9001:2015 standard requirements within those boundaries of an organization's QMS. Clear definition of the scope is vital to the successful implementation of a quality management system. ISO requires that all requirements of the ISO 9001:2015 standard that are applicable to the organization's scope be applied. However, there are exceptions. For example, Clause 4.1, Understanding the organization and its context, would be applicable to all organizations. However, Clause 8.3, Design and development of products and services, may not apply if the organization does not perform design and development activities as part of their business process. Obviously then, they would not develop processes and controls for these activities. This requirement could then be justifiably excluded from the scope of the QMS. It's important to keep in mind that excluding certain requirements or sections of the standard, just because it is convenient, is not valid justification when it comes to certification for the ISO 9001:2015 standard. Any exclusions pertaining to requirements must have sound justification for the exclusion, as well as ensure that the exclusion does not affect the organization's ability to meet conformity to requirements or the enhancement of customer satisfaction. In order to effectively determine the scope of its QMS, organizations must consider the external and internal issues as discussed previously in Section 4.1, Understanding the organization and its context. Also, there is the need for organizations to understand the requirements of all relevant interested parties as referenced in Section 4.2. This information is a required input to defining the scope of the quality management system, as organizations must determine if, and to what extent, the QMS extends to processes developed to address internal and external issues, including risk and opportunity, as well as the requirements of its interested parties. The scope of the QMS will differ for all organizations, as there are many factors to consider which are specific to the context of a particular business. With information gathered from the implementation of processes outlined in Sections 4.1 and 4.2, organizations are now much better equipped to define the boundaries of their quality management system. Referencing back to Clause 4, context of the organization is a common theme throughout the ISO 9001 standard, as this is essential for developing an effective quality management system. Another consideration when determining the scope of the QMS is the actual products and services offered by the organization. The organization must determine if all products and services produced will be included in the scope of the QMS, or if the scope will be limited to select products and services alone, and others excluded. Organizations must ask important questions of themselves in order to accurately define the scope of their quality management system. What areas of the organization should be incorporated under the QMS umbrella? Are all of the products and services that the organization produce going to be included or just a select few? Are all departments required to operate under the requirements of the QMS, such as finance and HR for example, or is the QMS scope limited to operations and production alone? Of course, it is better to make the QMS as broad as possible and include as much of the organization and its products and services as possible. But this is a decision that has to be made in the best interest of the organization. ISO 9001:2015 requires that the scope of the QMS be maintained and available as documented information, and must clearly determine and outline the boundaries of the quality management system. It must document and identify the products and services included within the scope of the QMS, as well as identify any products and services that have been excluded. This documented scope statement must also explain any justification for requirements of the standard that the organization has determined inapplicable to the scope of its QMS, and the requirements of the ISO 9001:2015 standard. This is required so that the scope of the quality management system is clear to all who have involvement with the processes and outputs of the QMS, not only those within the organization itself, but also to its stakeholders and relevant interested parties. Plus, in the case of certification to the standard, it must be clear to certification auditors that the organization has adequately defined the scope of the QMS, and that all applicable requirements are being met.